Yes. Whoever gets to this point first, ask the first question.
Okay. I would like to ask a question on the issues of structural adjustment that both of you have talked about. I know it's a big issue. The problems of the World Bank and the IMF are causing to not only the Caribbean countries, but to the African countries as well. And we know that probably after Haiti, there will be another case in which IMF and the World Bank and the CIA as well will be involved. My question is this. So many people are defining this as a new order, new world order phenomenon. What is your description of that new order phenomenon with regard to the structural adjustment? What do you think that the Caribbean countries and the African countries should do to defend themselves from this new phenomenon, whatever the phenomenon is? What is your description of that?
Who?
You first.
Me. Well, structural adjustment is actually not a new policy. It's a new version of an old policy. The policy, in fact, was described by Adam Smith and goes back to the 18th century, and we've been, plenty of experience with it. The idea is, at the core, it's very simple. We try to impose market discipline on countries that we're trying to destroy, while, of course, no wealthy country, no developed country would ever accept market discipline for itself. The reason why the United States is a rich country, and England is a rich country, and India is an impoverished country, and Egypt is an impoverished country, and right up till the present, is that there was enough force in the hands of England and the United States to radically violate market principles themselves, so that therefore they were able to develop, and to impose them on subject populations, which were about as developed as they were, like India and Egypt, so therefore they would underdevelop. So under British, you go back to the 18th century, India was roughly like England in terms of industrial development. In fact, and Britain had to set up high protective tariffs to to keep Indian textiles out. In fact, India was producing ships for the British Navy. Well, Britain had the force. So India underdeveloped and ended up being a completely impoverished agricultural country, and England developed. And the same is true of the United States, and the same goes right up to the present. There isn't a single country in history that has ever developed by following market principles. Every single one of them, crucially us, developed by radically violating those principles. Now that's why, and we continue to be extremely protectionist. The things we call free trade, like NAFTA, are usually protectionist, as NAFTA is. On the other hand, we have to impose market discipline on the poor, because then they'll be completely open to Western robbery, robbery by the rich. And that's the modern version of that is structural adjustment. So and its effects are very plain. So for example, during the 1980s, the flow of capital from the south to the north, poor countries to the rich countries, ran to roughly $500 billion in debt service alone. It's debt service alone. It's a fraction of the whole. That's about the equivalent of 6 Marshall Plans in today's dollars. That's from countries like sub-Saharan Africa to the United States and England and France. In fact, by now, the success stories of structural adjustment that the World Bank likes to hail, like Ghana, for example, are exporting capital even to the lending organizations, not just to the West, but to the lending organizations themselves. Well, that's the way you control people. The IMF just announced its new programs for Nicaragua just 2 weeks ago. Nobody ever reports it here, of course, front page news there. IMF means Washington. That's where they get their orders from. The new programs to Nicaragua are reduce the national debt to 0. Okay? If the United States had to do that, we'd be wiped out tomorrow. Privatize everything, meaning like water. So for example, if poor people, which is about 80% of the population, can't pay their water bills, their children die of dehydration. That's very important to achieve that. Cut down, stop all credits from the National Bank. Okay, so like no credits to bean farmers, for example. Cut off $60 million from social expenditures, which means to eliminate essentially what remains of the health and welfare programs. We've got to destroy all of those. The $60 million, incidentally, was probably picked because of its symbolic significance. You really like to torture people properly. Some of the banks have already been privatized. And last year, the privatized banks exported $60 million to the United States for reasons that any economist can explain to you. That's the efficient use of resources. Much more efficient to play the New York stock market than to give credits to poor bean farmers. So in fact, they lost their bean harvest. Well, that's structural adjustment. Now, of course, it's true that in the case of, say, Cuba and Nicaragua, we have special reasons for torturing them. Not just that we have to return them to their former status, but we have to teach a lesson to the third world. And the lesson is well understood in the third world, not understood here, because in our well-insulated, deeply indoctrinated society, we refuse to see obvious things. But in the third world, it's understood. The lesson is you stand up to the enforcer, and you don't only get crushed, but you get destroyed, and for a long time to come. Any mafia don understands that perfectly well. Okay, that's structural adjustment.
But I think this lesson you say is not accepted by the populace. It's not accepted by the popular forces. Most citizens know very well that structural adjustment is not in their interest, and there are interesting ways in which they are fighting it. I can't speak for the whole world, although it has been imposed on virtually 100 countries in the developing countries during the 1980s. In the Caribbean, what we see is that other systems, what has been called, for example, counter-plantation systems, have become very vibrant again. The informal sector, and a lot of these are initiatives by, small producers, a lot of women, a lot of people with, minimum or average levels of skills. And what people are doing is saying, before the state exits me, before the state would take me off the payroll, cut back social services, and so on, I need to find an alternative. So they begin more vegetable production. They look for alternatives. It doesn't always support whole families, and that's why you see what we saw in Grenada, which is a crisis within the communities, because social development just isn't going on. But people are surviving, and as I said, in the Caribbean, there are 2 or 3 different ways. One is, because we have relatives in the United States and Canada, people are trying to immigrate. And that's part of what, is called the boat people. I mean, people don't want to leave their countries, but they are forced to leave. That's one response. Another response is that citizens are not, as I said, not looking for jobs, because there are no jobs in the government. The government is shrinking. So they're finding cooperatives, they're doing community development. We have, again, very specific examples, the case of Gren fruit production in Grenada, where women form a cooperative and they produce for the domestic market fruits and vegetables and so on. And it isn't really the answer. I believe that the long-term answer is to have an economic system that responds to the social needs of the majority of the population. But in the interim, people are fighting it, and some people are doing well, but the vast majority are not. And so I think the structural adjustment program has to come to an end.
I'm Brian Kelly, a member of the International Socialist Organization. I want to ask, make 2 comments and then ask a question of both the speakers.
Speak out for the...
Okay. One is, I'm glad that Noam Chomsky stressed the continuity between the Bush administration and the Clinton administration, and also went back to Carter's policy towards Grenada, because I think it's important that people come to terms very quickly with what the Clinton foreign policy is. You see, it was Clinton that turned away, that was elected on the basis of lifting the ban on HIV immigrants and so forth, allowing patients into the country with political status, and he reversed himself almost, actually after the election, but before he took office. You also see Clinton's trying to increase the number of U.S. troops that are being deployed in Somalia. Over 1,000 Somalis have already been killed at the hands of UN and U.S. forces there. And I think it's important that people wake up to what the Clinton administration is all about. The question I have for both of you, and I think it's also important, is how do you see the role of the United Nations in the post-Cold War order? Because I think it's very important. The U.S. is going into Somalia, for instance, under the cover of a UN humanitarian mission. It's very quickly unraveled and been shown to be about something else. And I think, of course, the UN is important for people.
I have a one-line answer. I think in the 1980s in particular, as the United Nations was more and more responsive to the agenda from the South, the new International Economic Order, the new Information Order, the United Nations Development Program, UNESCO, UNICEF. These social agencies and social arms of the UN were very effective in one of the goals of the United Nations, which is to support development and well-being. As that happened, the Reagan administration in particular seized upon some of these agencies like UNESCO and mandated that these agencies withdraw from charging that some of them were corrupt, that they were not carrying out the mandate of the UN, which was to practice security rather than development. And this kind of attack, is, which was started in the 80s, is continuing in this new era, where I think the United States, and this is not just the presidency, but I think the larger political apparatus, many of whom are very vocal in the Congress, would prefer to see a UN that is under the control of the US. And that's the struggle, I think, that is going on.
Well, I would just change the dates a little. The UN, of course, the United States is overwhelmingly powerful. I mean, nobody's in the same league. We basically run the world. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the U.S. power was so enormous that the UN was just an agency of the United States. And at that time, the UN was very popular in the United States. It was a great force for peace and so on and so forth. In the 1950s, with decolonization and with the reconstruction of other industrial countries, the UN fell under what was called the tyranny of the majority, sometimes known as democracy. Under the tyranny of the majority, of course, the United States turned hostile to the UN. And by the mid-60s, start from around the mid-60s up until today, the United States has basically been trying to destroy it. So take a look simply at Security Council vetoes, which I've done. Incidentally, I have this in books if you want to look at it. The U.S. is, since the late 60s, the U.S. is far in the lead in vetoing Security Council resolutions. Britain second, France a distant third, and the Soviet Union fourth. The technical term for this is that the Soviet Union and the shrill third world voices were disrupting the UN. That's the way it's depicted in the press. Votes in the General Assembly are the same. You know, votes like 150 to 1 or 151 to 2 and so on and so forth. All of this is on a whole range of issues: observing international law, aggression, human rights, disarmament, in fact, the full range of issues. The UN was simply of no use any longer, and therefore the U.S. wanted to destroy it. It's of no use. This reached a peak with the efforts of UNESCO as a particular irritant because it was concerned with the third world, and that's finished. UNESCO has given up. They don't do much for the third world. Same with UNCTAD. The UN had a commission looking into transnational corporations, which are of supreme importance in the modern world. That was just disbanded, finished. We don't want any of that stuff. In the last few years, world changes have taken place of the kind that you know about that have again increased U.S. dominance, and by now the UN is once again essentially an agency of the United States. The third world is absolutely devastated, mostly by the catastrophic failures of capitalism in the 1980s, which has wiped out most of the traditional colonial domains. Whatever you think about the Soviet Union, however horrible they may have been, their existence created a certain space for non-alignment and independence. Their disappearance, meaning their return to the third world where they came from, which is what's going on now, eliminated that space, and it has left the third world completely open to U.S. attack. It's not that they're unaware of it. They are aware of it. So one of the leading Brazilian theologians, Cardinal Arns, pointed out recently that throughout the whole South, he said, there is hatred and fear. When are they going to invade us, and on what pretext? That's about right.
Yes, but that is...
And now the UN is a favorite again because it's doing what we tell it.
I agree with you, Noam, but I don't think that's the only sentiment in the South. I mean, that gets played up a lot. There's a tremendous that we are desperate, that we are frightened, that we have lost our hope. I think the collapse of the Soviet Union, whatever role it played, has left us feeling very vulnerable. I agree with you entirely. But you know what? I think we have to start looking in other places for sources of power. right? And it might take a long time to really emerge. And this is, I'm coming,
Yeah,
I'm coming back to my question.
You should look somewhere else.
Yeah, and that in the smaller places, among the places where there is no big spotlight, that's where it's happening. And I want to suggest that, in fact, the thing to do here in the U.S., I'm trying to answer my question I posed earlier. How do we get all the successful, progressive, wonderful pieces of ways in which this North interacts with the South? How do we get that to be the major pattern of behavior? I think it rests with people here. I think it rests in, with what you do with the U.S. society. And simultaneously, how do we recover in the South from the long-term colonial and imperial affront that we have been facing? Well, I think we have to continue to do the kinds of things that they're doing in Haiti, to say that despite the fact that we are uncertain of the future, we are going to stand up and put forward our agenda, and it has a cost. So it's very important to know that it isn't hopeless. In other words, I think optimism and courage and small initiatives are very important to keep in the face of the big, massive assault, because the U.S. is powerful, but it's not all powerful. It's not out there alone. It's even fighting now with Japan and Western Europe. The United States, for example, needs the Caribbean. You have a positive balance of trade with the Caribbean, whereas you're fighting to get a good trade balance with the Japanese and the Europeans. So, in other words, there's a book somebody wrote called that the weak, the weak is not powerless. Even the weak has something to contribute. And if we perceive ourselves as weak, I want us also to perceive ourselves as having power, including you, Noam.
Well, see, I quite agree that we should conceive ourselves as having potential power. We should be realistic, but we should be realistic means face reality. Reality is that right now the United States is in a position to exert its traditional historic agenda in most of the third world, and that's what we're seeing happen. Now, as long as the United States doesn't undergo a quite significant internal transformation, people in Haiti and Grenada and Nicaragua and other places are not going to be able to withstand that power. That's going to require substantial changes right here. We should certainly, how much hope we have is a kind of personal matter. That's what you should dedicate yourself to.
I want to agree with what Decimal Williams said earlier about the U.S. Not seeing the U.S. as being all powerful. And I think what's happened in Somalia proves that. I think that whatever you think of ideas of warlords in Somalia, they've made it less likely that the U.S. will intervene as quickly somewhere else in the world, and therefore I think you have to point.
I just think that's a complete misinterpretation. I mean, Somalia was a totally marginal issue for the United States. They wanted a little Pentagon PR. It got unpleasant, so they pulled out.
Yeah.
Okay, we're really running out of time.
Yeah,
I want to get to the people behind you. One last question. And because then we can continue the discussion over food outside in the hall.
I really want to draw on what Decima said about it not being totally hopeless, because I agree with everything you said in your analysis, and always have, as I think all clear-thinking people must. There just aren't that many of us that are able to survive the onslaught of the American-controlled media. But the hope lies precisely. C.L.R. James said that every major movement and development in the world since the, quote, New World came into being has begun in the Caribbean, and that the Caribbean has spawned so much, and I think it's spawning the response. It spawned it in Nicaragua, and that people's movement is not dead. It spawned it in Cuba, and whatever they do, the genuine revolutionary movement that began there will not die. And it spawned in Haiti. And on a very specific note, with regard to Aristide returning next week, Aristide, if he returns next week or next month, I think you're selling him short and the Haitian government short. They are aware of everything you've said, and we know, and all of us who support the Aristide government know, how difficult it is and how unlikely it is. But there is the glimmer of hope. There is the possibility that Clinton may just be that much more bumbling than Bush, and that Aristide and his government are shrewd negotiators, and that they may be able to overcome. And much more important than that, there is a genuine, powerful, grassroots, intelligent movement in Haiti, the La Valasse movement.
Well, I was in Haiti.
Is that we have to respond, as you said, and as Nesma said, we have to start the La Valasse movement here.
Yeah. I mean, I was in Haiti not too long ago, and indeed there was a very rich and vibrant movement which is now cowering in terror. the Aristide government certainly has hope, but they're not going to be able to implement that hope unless we do something. I mean, if we sit there and say, look, maybe they'll be able to outfox Clinton, you can predict exactly what's going to happen. If we do something to change U.S. policy, then there's hope.
Well, we better do it fast. We better do it
Well,
fast.
In Haiti, we better do it very fast because it's a matter of weeks.
Last one.
You want one more question?
This guy has been trying
Okay,
for a month.
Questions for Professors Chomsky and Williams
In that order.
in regards to Grenada and Panama, respectively. Are there still U.S. occupation troops there? And what is the nature of those troops? Like, are they armored? Are they infantry? Are they signal corps, psych op, administrative, or what?
I'll go first and talk about Grenada. I think the 6,000 troops landed, 10,000 stayed in the ships in the Grenadian waters, and 300 Caribbean police joined them as a symbolic support. I myself went back to Grenada at that time and was effectively chased out of the country 7 days later. I was interrogated by U.S. police. I was detained by U.S. police. My house was under guard by U.S. military police. In other words, I know what I say when I tell you about the occupation, and I know that some others have tried to say, look, the U.S. had to go in because the Cubans were there and they had to keep them calm, and the Caribbean and Grenadians took control of the country. This is absolutely not true. The main agenda was, in terms of long term, was to put into place a new security apparatus. And as Chomsky has said, this is an old pattern. In fact, in 1984, Philip Nicolaides from one of the conservative groups wrote a fundraising letter which was distributed widely to help raise money to install the government that actually came in 1984 with U.S. support. And in that letter, the lines actually said, give to this campaign so that we could help finish the job our Marines started. What a poke in the eye it would be if those whom we overthrew were able to come back in some other form through the elections. So that the idea was to make sure to consolidate a certain kind of agenda in the post-invasion period. And the security apparatus is very important. I cannot itemize now the sorts of things that went on. The detentions, the arrests, the wide array of violations of human rights. It took a year and a half for it was called the SSU, the Special Security Unit. And they were trained from all the small islands, and many times in the last 10 years they have been deployed. And I'll give you one incident and shut up. Just before the election, and one of the left parties was contesting the elections, there was a rumor that the revolutionaries and those who had been put in jail would be sprung from jail. The Grenada government invited all the security apparatus from the other Caribbean countries to come in and keep security in Grenada. That's how the system is working now. If there is a fear in Antigua, all the troops go there. If there's a fear in St. Vincent, all the troops go there. At the moment, when I was last there in August, there is a physical presence. There's a base right next to the U.S. Embassy in Grenada, and they continue to train. I'm not sure if it's just police or if it's army as well, but there is U.S. military training ongoing in Grenada now.
Well, just to mention Panama, of course, Panama is flooded with U.S. troops, and there's a major base in the canal zone right next door, which is one of the major U.S. bases. It's the base of SOUTHCOM, Southern Command of the United States. It's also recognized. You can read it in quite mainstream conservative journals, if you like. For example, Current History, which is, sort of standard political analysis journal, in their most recent article, issue on the Caribbean, the article on Panama points out that by January 1991, the Bush administration already understood that the so-called democratic government, that is the government it had put in power, couldn't withstand the Panamanian population unless U.S. troops defended it from the population. And they'll stay there. Now, what Desmond said is exactly right. It's been every imperial power, including the United States, has always much preferred to rely on local mercenaries called security forces. So the British, when they ran India for 200 years. They didn't use British troops. There's a thin scattering of British troops. They used 90% of the British troops holding India were Indian sepoys, usually brought from one area of the country to another, that sort of thing. And that's the standard system. The U.S. does it all the time. It's been official U.S. policy since the mid-1940s, now declassified, that we must gain control over the security forces in the countries of the Western Hemisphere. If we have control over the security forces, it doesn't matter much what happens in the civilian society, for obvious reasons. This reached a peak under the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy intellectuals, the Cambridge liberals, were much more insistent than anyone before in ensuring U.S. control over the security systems. And in fact, that led to a vast plague of repression over Latin America as country after country fell into the hands of neo-Nazi murderers, beginning with Brazil and running right through the 80s. And that remains the case today. Part of the U.S. antagonism to Nicaragua, incidentally, is that although the U.S. has pretty much what it wants, it still has not taken complete control of the security forces. That's what's called Sandinista control of the security forces, meaning you can walk around Nicaragua, unlike most countries of the region, without being terrified if you see a soldier or a policeman. Well, we got to change that. They've got to be under U.S. control, and then you can have any kind of government you like. But that's just our version of traditional imperial policies.
I think that
The faction, and this is a question about the fratricide that took place in Grenada. And what I'd like to ask about that is, what evidence is there, if any, for the kind of CIA or covert manipulation of whatever was going on there that intensified that? But apart from that, what was it that was going on independent of CIA or whatever manipulation, and what might have been done differently in the way in which the revolutionary project was being brought, was evolving, that might have lessened the possibility for that kind of, those differences of opinion to lead to the result that
I can't answer all of that. I'm writing a book on it. But what I can say to you is that the pressures from the hostility of both the Carter policy and the Carter administration and the Reagan administration created tensions inside. There's no doubt about that. I'll say to you that it will take quite a while before, if ever, the records of both administrations become available to the extent that we could understand the role of all these different agencies, including the DIA and the CIA. I don't have the answer to those records or access to those records now. And thirdly, I would say that internally, I think all political institutions, and it seems particularly true of revolutionary movements, have to resolve a number of variations on the theme of revolution, if you will. And it takes a while to have some understanding of, and common agenda, one program that is viable within the social and cultural context of the country. Noam will tell you how this happened in the case of the American Revolution and so on. In our case, we had those normal, traditional kinds of political dialogue. What is abnormal is that it led to such a crescendo and such a hatred and such a pitch. And that is unexplainable. And that is why many analysts are suggesting that it wasn't simply an honest and straightforward political difference of opinion that happens in any party, but that there must have been other kinds of crescendo in instigations like you had, say, for example, in the Black Panther Party and so on. But to date, we have no evidence of it. But I want to close by saying that there's a tremendous amount of fresh and healthy rethinking and good energy in the country, in Grenada, and throughout the region. A lot of it comes from the fact that we have a long popular movement in the trade union. We have We're not afraid to think revolutionary. I mean, we have had Cuba there as an inspiration, despite its problems now. We don't want to see it collapse into a big bloodbath. We don't want to see that in Haiti. And there's a high, good, positive energy. And I want to bring that message to Brandeis and to the United States and to say that even though we don't have a big economy and we don't have a lot of arms and ammunition, there's something there that if you talk to the students who went, they may have captured part of that, and that is our hope, that we believe in the future, we believe in ourselves, and that we are willing to try and try and try again until we get it right. So if these efforts can be supported by a healthy policy, I think that's in the interest of the region as well as in the U.S. We do, what Noam says is true. We don't need foreign aid. What is foreign aid? It's a recycling of corporate dollars in the South. And in the Caribbean, we sent more capital to the north in the same period that we are supposed to be getting foreign aid. So it's a very convoluted picture that you are given here, and I'm glad that we get this chance to talk a little bit about what, really is not so much the truth, but our truth.
Thank you. Why don't we close here?
I want to thank you. I want to thank you very much. I didn't want to spend October alone.
These guys who do this torture somehow have, like, for instance, Mitrione had 9 kids. How the hell could they live?
How the hell can faculty members at MIT and Harvard live when they're smart enough to figure out that, what I said, 100,000 people are dying in northeast Nicaragua because of policies.
Excuse me, the lapel mic, the Sony?
It's in the back on top of my jacket.
How can they live knowing that 11 million children are dying every year because they won't give it 3 cents for a vote?
It's amazing.
How did the Germans live? Look, take Nazi Germany. I mean, Hitler, the Holocaust was probably supported by maybe 5% of the population. I mean, everybody sort of knew about it, but they pretended, you convince yourself that you don't have to look some other way, so you do something else.
Well, a conservative friend, well, he's not really a friend because we always argue, but a conservative person that I know said that if people in Poland had just gone, yell outside their windows, look, just stop what you're doing, stop messing with these people, stop arresting the Jews, and that would have been enough. That's what I told them too.
Yeah, they would have been killed too. But in a country like this, it would be enough. So at least, the Nazis, you can at least, they have an excuse. Fear. We don't have an excuse.
I agree, 100%. Well, I'll let you go.
Yes. Whoever gets to this point first, ask the first question.
I would like to ask a question on the issues of structural adjustment that both of you have talked about. I know it's a big issue. The problems of the World Bank and the IMF are causing to not only the Caribbean countries, but to the African countries as well. And we know that probably after Haiti, there will be another case in which the IMF and the World Bank and the CIA as well will be involved. My question is this. So many people are defining this as a new world order phenomenon. What is your description of that new order phenomenon with regard to the structural adjustment? What do you think that the Caribbean countries and the African countries should do to defend themselves from this new phenomenon, whatever the phenomenon?
The United States and England and France. In fact, by now, the success stories of structural adjustment that the World Bank likes to hail, like Ghana, for example, are exporting capital even to the lending organizations, not just to the West, but to the lending organizations themselves. Well, that's the way you control people. The IMF just announced its new programs for Nicaragua just 2 weeks ago. Nobody ever reports it here, of course, front page news there. IMF means Washington. That's where they get their orders from. The new programs to Nicaragua are reduce the national debt to 0. Okay? If the United States had to do that, we'd be wiped out tomorrow. Privatize everything, meaning like water. So, for example, if poor people, which is about 80% of the population, can't pay their water bills, their children die of dehydration. That's very important to achieve that. Cut down, stop all credits from the National Bank. Okay, so like no credits to bean farmers, for example. Cut off $60 million from social expenditures, which means to eliminate essentially what remains of the of the health and welfare programs. We've got to destroy all of those. The $60 million, incidentally, was probably picked because of its symbolic significance. You really like to torture people properly. Some of the banks have already been privatized. And last year, the privatized banks exported $60 million to the United States for reasons that any economist can explain to you. That's the efficient use of resources. Much more efficient to play the New York stock market than to give credits to poor bean farmers. So in fact, they lost their bean harvest. Well, that's structural adjustment. Now, of course, it's true that in the case of, say, Cuba and Nicaragua, we have special reasons for torturing them. Not just that we have to return them to their former status, but we have to teach a lesson to the third world. And the lesson is well understood in the third world, not understood here, because in our well-insulated, deeply indoctrinated society, we refuse to see obvious things. But in the third world, it's understood. The lesson is you stand up to the enforcer, and you don't only get crushed, but you get destroyed, and for a long time to come. Any mafia don understands that perfectly well. Okay, that's structural adjustment.
But I think this lesson you say is not accepted by the populace. It's not.
Who?
You first.
Me. Well, structural adjustment is actually not a new policy. It's a new version of an old policy. The policy, in fact, was described by Adam Smith and goes back to the 18th century, and we've been, plenty of experience with it. The idea is, at the core, it's very simple. We try to impose market discipline on countries that we're trying to destroy, while, of course, no wealthy country, no developed country would ever accept market discipline for itself. The reason why the United States is a rich country, and England is a rich country, and India is an impoverished country, and Egypt is an impoverished country, and right up till the present, is that there was enough force in the hands of England and the United States to radically violate market principles themselves, so that therefore they were able to develop, and to impose them on subject populations, which were about as developed as they were, like India and Egypt, so therefore they would underdevelop. So under British, you go back to the 18th century, India was roughly like England in terms of industrial development. In fact, and Britain had to set up high protective tariffs to keep Indian textiles out. In fact, India was producing ships for the British Navy. Well, Britain had the force. So India underdeveloped and ended up being a completely impoverished agricultural country, and England developed. And the same is true of the United States, and the same goes right up to the present. There isn't a single country in history that has ever developed by following market principles. Every single one of them, crucially us, developed by radically violating those principles. Now that's why, and we continue to be extremely protectionist. The things we call free trade, like NAFTA, are usually protectionist, as NAFTA is. On the other hand, we have to impose market discipline on the poor, because then they'll be completely open to Western robbery, robbery by the rich. And that's the modern version of that is structural adjustment. So and its effects are very plain. So for example, during the 1980s, the flow of capital from the south to the north, poor countries to the rich countries, ran to roughly $500 billion in debt service alone. It's debt service alone. It's a fraction of the whole. That's about the equivalent of 6 Marshall Plans in today's dollars. That's from countries like sub-Saharan Africa to